Our next session is a dialogue with Prof Stanton, and it will be facilitated by Dr. Margie Maistry. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Prof Stanton. So Prof Stanton has been at Stanford for over 30 years. And in 2003, he was invited by Stanford Overseas Studies to establish a Cape Town-based academic program focusing on social and economic development with courses taught by local academics, intensive service learning, and partnership research. Prof Stanton co-founded and directed the Community Health Concentration at Stanford Medical School. He's also served as Associate Director and Director of the Haas Center for Public Service. He was Adjunct Education Lecturer for Queen's University in Ontario and Roberta Buffet Visiting Professor in International Studies at Northwestern University. Prior to joining Stanford, Prof Stanford, he directed the Human Ecology Field Studies at Cornell University. As a consultant for Campus Compact, a national consortium of university presidents committed to public service, Prof Stanton organized week-long faculty institutes on service learning curriculum development and coordinated the Research University Civic Engagement Network. And this network focused on community-based research. Related to his work, he wrote New Times Demand New Scholarship, Research Universities and Civic Engagement, and co-authored Trucen's online co-curated, and he also co-curated the Service Learning History Archive. Currently, Prof Stanton is a senior engaged scholar with Ravensong Associates, through which he consults on the design and the development of engaged scholarship in the US, Africa, and Asia. So I'll hand over to Dr. Margie Maistry to continue with the dialogue.
Good afternoon, everybody. So I've got my pad here and page because when Tim said he'd agreed to be the keynote speaker, and rather than doing an address, he thought, how about us doing it in this form of, an interview, a dialogue, a conversation. So I'm going to pretend I'm a journalist, okay? So even though journalists these days, I mean, they wouldn't be holding a pad and a pen in their hand. But those who know me know how technophobic I am. So even if I were a journalist, I'd still be using a pad and a page. So Tim and I, as you can see, have some knowledge of the historical trajectory of community engagement. And in two different contexts, but also there's this interaction between the contexts. So Tim from his American context and here the South African context. And yesterday when we were talking about this process and what we want to actually come out of this conversation, and this is going to be a conversation, it's not going to be heavy stuff. So in the last 10 minutes, I would like to see everybody else participating in this conversation. What we would like to come out of this is to look at the trajectory of community engagement in the South African context, in the American context. But what is important is this form of community engagement we call service learning, but in the American context, it is service learning and community engagement. So there's a difference in the conceptualization of community engagement in the two contexts. But what is also quite interesting is in the early years in South Africa, when we started a kind of formalizing and trying to understand what community engagement means for the South African context as a core function of higher education institutions, we got the American experts in service learning to come in. Fortunately or unfortunately, Tim was one of them.
Guilty as charged.
And I remember in those early years, because it was like we were grappling with what is community engagement, what makes up community engagement. And here we have the American influence, and a lot of us actually reference the American scholars in service learning, because they wrote more on service learning and not much on community engagement, right? So,
back in those days.
Yes, in those days. So we kind of reference them in service learning. So this idea of service learning, as I'm saying, had a lot of influence, American influence. So in the early years, we were grappling with what is community engagement, what are the various forms of community engagement. And what came out then quite dominantly was this idea of service learning. And there were people in the various institutions, universities, actually having been influenced by the American context and the American academics coming in, focusing on service learning. So service learning has had quite a history in the South African context. So I'm going to ask Tim to just give us a little bit of background of where his background into working with communities first, because Tim will tell you he wasn't an academic who got involved with service learning and community engagement in the American context. So Tim will give you some background into how he got into service learning and working with communities. Is that okay, Tim?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to participate in this session in this way, and I hope we can be successful in what we're attempting to do. But yes, I think when I think about my entry into this field, and I was fortunate in a way and unfortunate in other ways to come of age during the late 1960s in the San Francisco Bay Area, which was a hotbed of progressive war resistance, draft resistance, civil rights work, in which I was very engaged as a university student. And the formative experience in my undergraduate years was preparing a proposal for conscientious objection to the draft. And so I was very involved in the street protests and everything else. And I was learning in those years that the best education I was getting was on the streets and not in the classroom. And my friends, and I would often have long discussions into the evening in those days, which in retrospect were reflective seminars, and in which we were trying to figure out what was going on, what we were trying to do, how successful it was or wasn't, and what we were learning from it. And we didn't have a facilitator, but we kind of facilitated ourselves. And from that experience, I graduated and moved into a community organizing role just north of, in San Francisco and just north of San Francisco, primarily working with young people and trying to organize them and engage them in civil action. And I was fortunate I had a very small foundation to support our work. And we started doing projects because the original mandate was just get these kids involved in volunteer work. Just go into the schools and line up things for them to do with the nonprofit organizations and get them involved. So that didn't sound too complicated. We went in the schools and outlined what we had to offer the students, and they sort of sat there quietly and politely, and we walked out with very few volunteers. And so we quickly kind of figured out this isn't going to work. And we'd also learned along the way that the community organizations in those days really didn't want young people around anyway. And so we got to organize our own projects. So we organized an alternative youth newspaper that did some amazing journalistic work and got us in trouble with the County Board of Supervisors. We organized political events. various kinds. And we organized a therapeutic recreation program in which high school kids that we invited to work with us were running therapeutic recreation groups for kids who were in mental health therapy and didn't have any homes to go to after school. And the therapists were interested in helping them learn social development skills. Long story short, after a year of running these groups, the students were saying, well, we're learning more from this than anything we're getting in school. And the therapist said, these kids are building social skills and it's not happening in our offices. It's not in the therapy. Something's going on in those groups. So in retrospect, that was a service learning program. We had a reflective seminar. It would look like the kinds of things you all are doing now. What was exciting for me was in the midst of doing that work, I came across an advertisement for a conference in Los Angeles on something called service learning. And I came to learn. I immediately jumped in my car and went to that conference. And I met a small group of colleagues who became lifelong friends and colleagues in this work and it turned out they had very similar experiences. Most of them had come out of the community like I had, and they viewed these institutions, in the words of one of them who was in Nashville working as a health organizer, looking at Vanderbilt University, a large research university there. They said, I just got to get inside that institution and throw open the windows and get the resources of that institution out into the communities. And our small network that began to meet regularly and annually, as I mentioned to somebody yesterday, our annual meetings became summer camp for those of us, because by then I had moved to Cornell University and running a field studies program there with 3 wonderful colleagues. And we were constantly under fire from the powers that be within the university. We developed a magnificent program because we had support from the college dean. And we began to be invited all over the US to talk about what we were doing because people were so interested. And when we came back to the Ithaca campus, we put on body armor before we walked back on the campus because we were doing several things that were just not okay. One of them was experiential learning. One of them was sending them off campus where they were out of control of the university. And one of them was that we had created an interdisciplinary curriculum, which was also verboten back in the early and mid 1970s, early 1980s. But through that, my work and that of all the other people that were involved in this network, and surely others came to be, and those who were doing it began the struggle of how do you get a toehold within an institution and build yourself into the academy. How do we, with the ultimate goal, can we change academies so that they are a safe space to do this work without losing the edge of the work in doing so? One of our colleagues in those early conferences always offered a workshop every year on marginality. And he was always saying, we're trying to burrow into these institutions, but never lose the perspective of working on the margins that you had. Because the people inside the fishbowl, the fish they don't know they're fish, but you know because you're watching, looking in the outside, and you also can see the community because you're all on the margins of the community. So trying to be brief here, but it's a long story. So the work began to build up, and just now to trace how the field progressed in those early years, even up to the end of the 20th century, became, even though many of us came from communities and were committed to communities, as the field expanded and grew, it became a lot more about pedagogy development and academic development and student outcomes. And I'm guilty of all that as anybody else with my work at Stanford, but we felt a need. We had to do that for the field to survive and thrive. We had to do that if we were going to have an impact on our communities, our universities, which then might be better members of their communities, which many of our institutions were not, and still are not. I was lucky at Stanford, I had a university president who supported our work and said, you need to work with the faculty, you need to do this, you need to do that, but what I want you to do is change this university. So we had that mandate of academic change, but the work largely evolved so that particularly the younger people coming into the field saw themselves as educators, not community organizers. And so there were identity issues between the old guard and the younger people coming in. And I don't mean to criticize them in any way for this. It's just an evolution of a practice. And then at the turn of the century, the concept of community engagement came into play roughly then. And nobody quite knew what to do with these words, service learning, community engagement. I think now, perhaps much like what's going on here, a lot of people view community engagement as I would call an umbrella term, under which service learning is a pedagogical approach to community engagement. Happens to be called service learning. As I said yesterday, all that language in my view has tremendous vagueness and baggage, and we need to work further to refine how we talk about what we do. But the trajectory of this work has been fascinating to be a part of. And I think what I'd finally just throw in is by the late 1990s, some of us were beginning to think about research as a form of community service and public scholarship. We actually began an undergraduate community research program at Stanford in 1996, which was, we were just feeling our way. We didn't quite know what it was, but we were taking students in their fourth year honors year when they were writing their honors theses and said, what would research look like if you thought of it as a form of community service? And how would that change the practice and the role of the researcher, the role of those who were quote unquote researched, and the role of the faculty, mentors, and advisors. I'll stop there because I know you have more questions.
So yeah, my question to you from listening to what you were saying. So your initial work with the university, was it to give the students just an experiential experience, or what was the purpose behind getting the students out?
Yes and no.
Yeah.
I mean, it was more than that. Yes, it was. From the beginning, I was always interested in the student development aspects of engaging in this kind of work. In those days, adolescents were thought of as not yet people by a lot of us in the US. They were not yet people because there were no adult roles for them to play. They were sequestered in classrooms from kindergarten to graduating high school and even through the university because there were not these opportunities then. So part of it was youth participation, then what can be learned from this kind of participation, and how is that learning facilitated by whom and where? But that meant also participation in what? In communities in an impactful, helpful way, and finding roles and activities that could do it. And I think in the very beginnings, our goals were pretty modest. Can we do no harm? Can we be helpful in ways? And can we provide experiences for young people that are challenging, but not too challenging, that they become turned off and frustrated by it? So fine-tuning those community experiences with the partners so that it was the right level of challenge for the right kind of students, which meant in day-to-day practice as a instructor, organizer, I needed to know my students very well to figure out where I might want to place them in the community. And I had to know my partners very well. So a lot of it was relationship building with everybody in order to make this work.
So initially also the concept that was used in the States was community service.
Well, volunteerism, community service,
Yeah.
evolving into service learning, and a lot of the early service learning writing and practice was trying to unpack the word service.
Service, yes. Because the reason I'm asking is that the documents, our initial policy documents, refer to community service and not to community engagement.
Yes, that's
Okay,
right.
so that also is part of the American influence into the drafting of the documents. So it was community service. Only later on, I mean, with Sahisev and we started talking about community engagement. Bibi, where are you? Yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, you are.
Yeah. So it was changing this community service into community engagement. So you came into the South African scene, I presume, correct me if I'm wrong, around 1997 in the CHESS project. For those who don't know, you do know what the CHESS project was. It was a community higher education service project where it was service learning was put into effect, I think, in about 10 universities, and there was research done on what service learning was in these 10 universities. So it was the CHESS project. So you came into the South African context then in 1997.
My first visit here was 1996
Yeah.
to a conference at UCT. And as a result of that experience, I was introduced to Joe Lazarus, who was organizing CHESS
Yes.
based on his experience with a Kaiser Foundation project. And when I saw the design for CHESS, I thought, this is the most intricate, complicated, ambitious, professional capacity building plan I'd ever seen in my life. And it was very exciting being part of it. And it had its moments of huge frustration for everybody involved, I think, for a variety of reasons. But it was amazing in its comprehensiveness and the fact that we, as the so-called advisors, most of us from outside South Africa, could stay engaged with the South African participants over a 3 or more year period of sustained interaction. In terms of a development project, that's very unique. Because most funders have attention deficit disorders and don't stick with projects as long as that was Ford Foundation funded. And they funded that project, I believe, for 8 years.
So for those who are interested, I think it's a Kagiso Trust, again, Bibi. There's articles there about the whole CHESS project itself. So what had happened then with us, with the and service learning did so initially, and I know the University of Stellenbosch and some other universities organized conferences on service learning. So it was service learning and not so much community engagement. I think with the formation of Sahisev and the first combined Sahisev University of Fort Hare Rhodes University conference in 2011 that we had in East London was this coming together. I think it was then quite strongly service learning was seen as part of community engagement. So the conference covered the various forms of community engagement with service learning as a pedagogy in community engagement. So the terminologies actually changed from community service to community engagement. And I think I remember there was a conference organized by the University of Indianapolis, and I think it was Indianapolis, and Stellenbosch University in Greece. And it was really significant there because it was still this idea of service learning. And when I looked at the publication that came out of that conference, you know, it was very clear because the context was different. And we must never forget that our community engagement is based on the development and the transformation agenda in our country. And in the American context, that didn't exist, So it was like bringing something in from a context that didn't talk about development and transformation in the way that we were talking about it, and how community engagement fitted into that. So what do you think, Tim, were some of the challenges, the early challenges that we were experiencing here and you were experiencing there in the States? Because this leads to, and I don't know how much of time we have, Renee, to the question of coming full circle, coming full circle to community engagement in the States also. Marisol will give you some time for your input just now. Okay, so some of the challenges that you think we had experienced here, and some of the challenges that's similar or different to the challenges you have experienced.
All right. Well, I mean, sticking with the labels and the language, just as one place to start, we experienced that too. My feeling about it, in our early years at Stanford, when we were trying to get faculty colleagues to take a step and experiment with trying to lead and develop a service learning course, our supportive president gave me a pot of money, and which we came to term the bribe fund. And he said, write an RFP, a request for proposals, and see if you can get anybody to take a little money to try this out. And I didn't want to use any labels, and I purposely avoided labels, and I wrote a 5-page paper inviting them to apply for us. These were very small amounts of money, which I described in visual words and without putting labels on it, because labels at our university, and I think we're not unique in this way, in my view, we're getting us into trouble and confusion. And so let's just talk about what the work is without boxing it up in a label. And then as we progressed at Stanford along those lines, people kept saying, we need a definition of service learning. We need to put it, students want it in the transcript, and they want to check off that. And I, as director of the campus-wide center at the time, resisted that mightily. And I just said, you put a label on it and people will feel excluded. And I remember a faculty member in one of our meetings where this debate was raging, and she finally stood up and said, if you put that definition, make that definition, you leave me out. And I teach a course that doesn't meet all the bulleted criteria you have for what makes service learning, but it is service learning, and I'll tell you why. And she proceeded to do that, and she had a fabulous course. So, so we resisted, and I kind of felt like there's so many different definitions of service learning flying around at that time. Let 100 flowers bloom. Maybe that's the way for this field to develop. And if you box it up, you shut down possible creativity or deviance. You need deviance for development. So, so I think it is very helpful. What's happened here is, I understand it, is that you at least have a clear understanding that this is community engagement and it really encompasses the institution. And then you have service learning as part of the teaching and learning function of the institution and pedagogically based. And that makes very good sense to me. And I think we're getting there in the US as well. But it's been a long journey getting there and a bumpy road. And I think that's appropriate.
Input from the audience participate in this conversation, because we're still on a trajectory here. And I think from what has been presented in yesterday and part of today, has been an amazing content-filled presentations, and it's taking our journey further into fine-tuning this notion of community engagement in South Africa. So, questions then?
There's a time for everything, and I'm wondering, and maybe the two of you can't answer it, but maybe somebody in our audience can. If it weren't for chess, would we have had the inclusion of community engagement in the white paper of 1997?
Well, I don't know for sure. I know there were some machinations around that, and said not me, but a colleague from the U.S. was involved in those discussions. But if she's the correct person, she tended to use the word public service rather than service learning, and I had issues with her about that personally. But although she's a good friend still, but I don't know the background of that, except that we didn't have anything like the white paper in the U.S. and partially that's because we have a very weak education department in relation to higher education, and some of the states regulate more than others, but it's pretty laissez-faire for colleges and universities, and they do their own thing, for better or worse.
And in the American context, correct me if I'm wrong, so community engagement isn't seen as a core function, like we clearly stated, of higher education institutions, is it?
Well, Marisol probably has a wider vision than I do now, but I would say it's hard to generalize about that. I mean, some institutions have taken a very strong stand on this, like the University of Pittsburgh I mentioned yesterday. But others, I mean, my institution, Stanford, has not. I think many institutions, maybe most of the research universities still struggle with this idea that they have any role in development work.
But it's not a national imperative here,
No,
for
not at all.
function of higher education.
We have no national imperatives.
Yeah, you don't. So in South Africa, because this is why at that time in 2011, I clearly stated at that conference, the context are different because ours is a national imperative and community engagement has a developmental and a transformative role to play, and the state, it doesn't. So therefore, those who came in to contribute to helping us understand what service learning was all about couldn't actually, and this is my own biased view, okay? Couldn't really understand the context in which it should fit in. So because I was clearly knowing, at that stage where we were and what the role of community engagement was meant to be.
Thank you very much. Now, when we talk about community engagement as core function, in theory it is, yes, South Africa, but in practice, then there's a lot of questions. If you look at a pathway, people